She was 22 years old. She stood just over 5 feet tall and had a habit of whistling old hymns under her breath while she worked the counter at her family's grain elevator. On the night of November 9th, 1977, Wanda Skoglund locked up the elevator office at closing time, walked to her car parked at the edge of the gravel lot, and never made it home. That is not a story about a farm girl who took too long driving home in a snowstorm. That is a story about a man who'd hauled grain to that same elevator every harvest for 20 years, who stood beside her family at every single Lutheran church potluck for the next 47 years. And it would take a sheriff's deputy who kept the case file in his own truck long after retirement, a genealogy website meant for people tracing their family trees, and a single glove found frozen in a ditch to finally expose him. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to that November night. Because to understand what Hollis Creek lost, you first have to understand who Wanda Skoglund was. Hollis Creek, North Dakota, in 1977 was a grain elevator town on the edge of the Red River Valley, flat as a tabletop in every direction, where the wind never really stopped, and everyone measured the year by harvest rather than by calendar. The air that November smelled like diesel from the combines and the sharp cold that comes before the first real snow. And on Friday nights, you could hear a CB radio crackling out of somebody's pickup parked outside the co-op caf. Hollis Creek didn't have a stoplight, didn't need one. It had one grain elevator, one Lutheran church, and a caf that stayed open late during harvest season, because half the farmers in the county needed somewhere warm to sit after a 16-hour day in the field. Nobody in Hollis Creek locked a door. Everybody in 3 counties knew Wanda Skoglund by the sound of her whistling before they ever saw her face. Wanda was the only daughter in a family of 4 boys, the one who'd taken over the elevator office bookkeeping from her mother the year she turned 19. Keeping every farmer's grain ticket straighter than anyone before her. She had a habit of whistling old hymns she'd learned in church choir, without ever quite noticing she was doing it, right up until a customer would laugh and ask what song that was supposed to be. Her father, Merle, ran the elevator itself, 3 generations deep in the family, and every farmer in the county called him by his first name out of respect, rather than familiarity. Her mother, Alva, kept the church's altar guild running with military precision and had taught all 4 of her sons and her 1 daughter to drive a grain truck before they could legally hold a license. Wanda kept a spare set of mittens in her coat pocket at all times, a habit that started the winter she was 12 and got frostbite walking home from a stalled-out car, and she checked, without fail, that her car doors were locked twice before walking away from it, not from fear, but out of a stubborn refusal to ever be caught out in the cold again. Hollis Creek in 1977 did not believe harm came from inside its own community. That belief held the whole town together. The unlocked elevator office, the girls who drove home alone after dark without a second thought, the way a stranger's car got noticed and talked about at the co-op caf before it had even parked. Nobody in Hollis Creek that November had any reason to think that belief was wrong. That was the last harvest anyone in the Skoglund family would believe it either. At 9:15 that night, Wanda locked the elevator office door behind her, same as she did most closing nights, and told her father over the CB radio she'd be home within the half hour. At 9:20, a farmer dropping off a late grain sample saw her walking toward her car in the gravel lot, breath fogging in the cold. That was the last time anyone outside her family saw her whole. By 9:55, Merle grew uneasy on the CB. Wanda always called in when she pulled into the driveway, and the radio had stayed silent. By 10:15, he drove the route himself, headlights cutting through a light snow that had started falling. By 10:40, he found her car pulled halfway onto the shoulder of County Road 12, engine off, Driver's door open, dome light burned out from being left on too long. Her purse sat on the passenger seat, ticket book still inside it, pen clipped to the cover. No Wanda. Merle radioed the sheriff's office immediately. Deputies arrived within the hour. By midnight, half the men from the co-op CAF were walking the ditches on both sides of County Road 12, flashlights cutting through falling snow, calling her name into wind that swallowed every sound whole. Vern Tollefson, who hauled grain to the Skoglund elevator every harvest and had known Wanda since she was in pigtails, was one of the first men out there, walking the ditch line shoulder to shoulder with Merle. 9 straight nights of searching turned up nothing but a scattering of tire tracks the falling snow had already half erased. One detail got logged and nearly forgotten that first week: a single leather work glove, found frozen into the ice at the bottom of the ditch, nearly a quarter-mile from Wanda's car, not matching any of the search party's gear. Deputies bagged it anyway, more out of habit than expectation. In 1977, a single glove told you nothing except that someone, at some point, had lost a glove. It went into an evidence box at the county courthouse and stayed there for nearly 5 decades. Deputy Roland Asson took the case that week, 9 years into the job, and, by his own later admission, entirely unprepared for something this senseless in a county this small. He was the kind of investigator who kept every open case's photograph clipped inside his truck's sun visor, so it was the first thing he saw every single morning before anything else. For Wanda Skoglund, that photograph stayed clipped there for the rest of his career. 2 threads ran side by side that winter. Officially, Asson and the county sheriff's office canvassed every farm within 15 miles, questioned every trucker who'd hauled grain through the elevator that week, and chased a tip about a stranger's sedan seen near the co-op CAF the night Wanda vanished. Asson's own notes from that first month describe a county desperate to help, and with almost nothing solid to offer. Half the tips that came in described cars that had nothing to do with the case at all. One name did surface hard and fast: a seasonal grain hauler who'd argued loudly with Merle over a weighing dispute 2 weeks earlier, and who left the county entirely within days of Wanda's disappearance. On paper, he looked close to perfect: a public grudge, a hasty exit, a reason to have been near that road in the dark. Asson chased him for the better part of a year, tracked him to a trucking job in Montana, and cleared him completely. A way station logbook placed his rig 200 miles away, the exact night Wanda vanished. It was Hollis Creek's first dead end, and it cost the investigation nearly a full year of momentum. Asson would say, years later, that clearing that hauler felt worse than finding nothing at all, because it meant whoever had taken Wanda wasn't some stranger passing through with an axe to grind. He wasn't ready to sit with that thought yet, not for a long while. By the following spring, the search had scaled down to occasional tips that led nowhere, and a handful of letters from self-proclaimed psychics, whose visions never matched a single detail investigators had on the ground. The physical evidence sat in one thin folder at the county courthouse: the glove, a partial tire impression from the shoulder of County Road 12 that never matched anyone questioned, a scrap of fabric caught on a fence post that could have come from almost anyone's work coat. Asson kept driving that stretch of road on his own weekends anyway, long after the official search wound down, stopping at farmhouses to ask questions that had already been asked twice before. Personally, Merle and Alva Skoglund kept living in a house with a bedroom neither of them could bring themselves to touch. Wanda's grain ticket book stayed on the elevator office counter exactly where she'd left it, pen still clipped to the cover. Her boots stayed by the back door for years, waiting for feet that never came home to fill them again. Alva stopped attending the county fair after 1978. Wanda had loved that fair, had run the church's pie booth there every summer since she was 14, and Alva couldn't stand in that crowd without searching every face in it for her daughters. The institutional failure that would follow Asen for the rest of his life was a simple one. In 1977, nobody seriously considered a man Wanda already knew and trusted from around the elevator. Investigators' files from that winter show they questioned strangers, seasonal haulers, men with grudges, but not the farmers who'd stood beside Merle in that ditch line at midnight, flashlights in hand, calling her name as loud as anyone. Why would you suspect the man who'd hauled grain to that elevator for 20 straight harvests? The county rallied for months and then, as small towns do, slowly went back to its rhythms. Grain trucks kept rolling through the elevator lot. School reopened after Christmas break with an empty desk nobody mentioned out loud. Hollis Creek never stopped being Hollis Creek for anyone except the Skoglunds. By 1982, 5 years had passed, and the ditch line searches were a memory kept alive only in old clippings from the county paper. The missing person notice tacked to the co-op cafe's front window had faded to something barely legible from years of sun through the glass, but nobody ever took it down. Families moved into 2 different farmhouses along the Skoglunds Road over those first 5 years. And each set of new neighbors learned, gently and quickly, not to ask about the elevator office bookkeeper whose photograph still hung behind the counter, a fixture nobody at the elevator ever considered taking down. By 1990, Merle Skoglund had aged in a way that had nothing to do with the calendar. He handed the elevators day to day, running over to his sons early, couldn't stand behind that same counter anymore, without expecting to hear Wanda whistling from the back room. But he never left Hollis Creek, in case Wanda ever came looking for home. That same year, the county repaved County Road 12 itself, and Asen drove out personally to walk the ditch one more time before the construction crews arrived, just in case there was anything left in that frozen ground to find. By 1998, Wanda's brothers had children of their own, kids who knew an aunt only through a single photograph behind the elevator counter, a young woman frozen forever at 22, while their own parents grayed around her. Every one of those nieces and nephews grew up understanding, without ever quite being told why, that nobody in the family drove County Road 12 after dark without a second thought crossing their mind. Deputy Roland Asen retired in 2006. He did not stop working Wanda's case. He kept the file, grown by then to 3 cardboard boxes, in the cab of his own truck for years before finally moving it to his garage. And whenever a new forensic technique made the news, he drove it to the state crime lab in Bismarck himself and asked them to try again. In 2011, he requested the first DNA testing ever attempted on that leather glove. The sample was too degraded for the technology of that era to produce anything usable. He filed the results and kept waiting. Alva Skoglund died in 2015, Wanda's grain ticket book still sitting behind that same counter, pages yellowed, but never moved. Merle kept it there after her, dusting around it, but never once relocating it an inch. Every November 9th, without fail, he drove out to County Road 12, stood near the ditch where the glove had been found, and stayed until the cold drove him back to his truck. Vern Tollefson, who still hauled grain to that same elevator every harvest, was often one of the people who saw Merle out there, and every year, without fail, he was the one who pulled his truck over, walked out to stand beside him a while, offering a quiet word of sympathy, as if he were simply an old friend, rather than the reason Merle was standing there at all. The county moved on around Merle. He never did. Every case on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that were lost. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, please take a second to like this video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what makes this possible. Now, let's get back to Wanda. Then, in 2024, something happened that no one in Hollis Creek had dared to expect. It would take a forensic extraction technique built for evidence far too degraded for older equipment, and a genealogy database designed for people tracing their own family trees to break open a case even the Skoglunds had quietly stopped believing would ever resolve. On a Tuesday morning in March, a forensic analyst at the State Crime Lab in Bismarck was running the old leather glove through a new DNA recovery process meant specifically for decades-old, weather-damaged evidence, when a usable profile finally emerged where 2 previous attempts had failed completely. She cross-referenced it against a public ancestry database. The process works the same way anyone might trace their own family tree. Crime scene DNA gets uploaded and compared against genetic profiles that ordinary people have voluntarily submitted while researching their own ancestry. And investigators build outward from any distant relative match until the branches narrow down to a single person. A distant cousin match flagged on her screen. She read the name twice, then called the number still listed for Roland Asen, retired 18 years, because she knew from the case file that he'd want to hear it before anyone else did. Asen later said he sat in his kitchen with the phone in his hand for a full minute before he trusted his own voice. He drove the 3 boxes of files to the county courthouse himself that same week, the way he'd done for nearly 3 decades, except this time he let himself believe it might finally matter. The genealogy team spent the following weeks tracing that single distant match through a family tree rooted almost entirely in the Hollis Creek area, ruling out cousin after cousin, until the DNA pointed to one family that had farmed that same county for generations, and one branch of it led straight to a name nobody in that town had ever once considered: Vern Tollefson. The very man who'd hauled grain to the Skoglund elevator every harvest for over 40 years. The man who had walked that ditch line himself in 1977, who had stood beside Merle Skoglund at nearly every single anniversary for close to 5 decades, offering quiet words of comfort. Vern Tollefson had never been seriously questioned in 1977. He wasn't a stranger, wasn't the seasonal hauler with a grudge, wasn't anyone investigators had reason to look at twice. He'd spent the next 47 years as one of the most familiar trusted faces at the Hollis Creek elevator. First, understand how normal he seemed. Tollefson farmed the same land his whole life and hauled grain to that elevator every single harvest without missing a season. He served on the church council for over 20 years. He was the man half the county called first if a combine broke down mid-harvest and someone needed a hand finishing before the weather turned. For nearly 5 decades, Vern Tollefson was, by every visible measure, one of the most decent men in Hollis Creek. Second, the small things that only made sense in hindsight. Neighbors who recalled, only when finally asked directly, that Tollefson had thrown out an entire pair of work gloves that same November week in 1977, telling anyone who asked they'd simply worn through. That he'd avoided driving County Road 12 himself for nearly a year afterward, taking the long way around by the section line instead, before eventually forcing himself back to using it. That he flinched every single November at the very anniversary walk he himself never missed joining Merle for, and that everyone had always read that flinch as shared grief rather than what it actually was. Third, the moment the truth became undeniable. Investigators obtained a warrant for a direct DNA sample from Tollefson, now 79 years old, still farming the same land, still hauling grain to the same elevator, still attending the same small Lutheran church as the Skoglunds. The sample matched the profile recovered from the glove with a certainty the lab called conclusive, a match so specific it left no room for coincidence. When deputies arrived at his farm to make the arrest, Tollefson reportedly said only that he had wondered for 47 years when this day would come, before he went quietly into custody. Word moved through Hollis Creek within hours. Farmers who had unloaded grain beside him for decades sat in their kitchens that night, unable to speak. The county that had believed harm never came from inside its own community now had to reckon with the fact that the worst thing that had ever happened there had been standing in that same elevator lot beside them the entire time, offering comfort at every anniversary for a wound he alone had caused.
आकर्षक कंटेंट में बदलें और शेयर करें. The community's reaction wasn't disbelief so much as a slow, sick recalibration, farmers quietly running back through decades of small interactions with Vern Tollefson, wondering what they'd missed, wondering what else, in a county this small, could still be hiding behind a familiar, friendly face. Tollefson was charged with Wanda Skoglund's murder. He pled guilty rather than face trial, and in a taped statement, Asen insisted on hearing in person. He told investigators where he had left her remains that night in 1977, a shelter belt of trees less than a mile off County Road 12 that had since grown so dense nobody had ever thought to search that deep into it. He was sentenced to life in prison. He was 79 years old. Wanda Skoglund was 22 years old. She whistled hymns without knowing she was doing it. She kept a spare pair of mittens in her coat pocket and a ticket book still sitting, pages yellowed. Behind an elevator counter, her father could never bring himself to clear. She had a future that belonged to her by right, and Vern Tollefson's aunt took it from her on Tollefson to her by right. She had an ordinary November night in a county that believed, with its whole heart, that nothing like that could happen there. Merle Skoglund, 91 years old by the time of the arrest, was finally able to bury his daughter's remains beside her mother's grave, 47 years after he'd last heard her voice crackle over the CB radio. Aj, he told report or share kare. I drove that road November for 47 years. I just didn't know I was driving it to see the man who put me there. How many other small towns are still carrying a version of Vern Tollefson inside them right now, a man everyone trusts precisely because no one has ever had a reason to look closely? What does it say about justice that the thing which finally broke this case open was a piece of technology built for people looking up their family trees? For fun, not for chasing down killers. Fun, not for chasing down killers. And what do we owe the families who keep a ticket book behind a counter for decades, refusing to let the world forget what it would rather move past? Justice came for Wanda Skoglund after 47 years. Her story is a reminder that truth, however late, has a way of finding the light, even when it takes a lifetime, and even when it was standing in the same lot beside you the entire time. If this story moved you, subscribe so you don't miss the next case we uncover, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Thank you for watching.